Welcome, everybody, to the Popanimecomics Lounge, Episode 6. My guest today is Denny O'Neil, who is a comic book writer slash comic book editor who's written Green Arrow, Batman, he's written Wonder Woman, and so many other great titles in DC, as well as some titles in Marvel. He's also, as I stated, edited a bunch of Batman, and he's one of the longest reigning editors on the Batman franchise up to this date. This interview is divided into two parts. This is part one. Just want to let everybody know that part two will be out next week. So stay tuned for part two next week. Best way to find part two is to subscribe to this podcast so this podcast finds you and you don't find it. Before we get into the interview, I just want to mention that if you would like to support this podcast, please check out popanimecomics.com. Click on support the podcast link. There's a link to amazon.com, which if you're going to do shopping on amazon.com, if you click it, I get a small percentage back, which helps to keep my production costs lower. So here's the interview, everybody. I hope you enjoy it, and hopefully you'll stick around for part two next week. How did you get into comics?
By accident, I was working on a newspaper in a little southeast Missouri town, and I wrote a couple of articles about the revival of comics. This was when Stan Lee and Julie Schwartz were in the process of reinventing comic books and superheroes after almost 10 years of near extinction. And I wrote about that, and one of Roy Thomas's parents subscribed to the paper. Roy got in touch with me. I went to interview him. I had a fantastic Sunday afternoon in his apartment because he was introducing me to this whole subculture that I had no idea existed. I thought it was all very nifty. So I wrote another piece about Roy, who had just accepted an offer to go to work for Mort Weisinger at DC Comics. And Roy and I hung out a little bit, and then he went to New York, and some time passed, about a month. And he got in touch with me, had stopped working for Mort after 2 weeks, and gone to work for Stan Lee in Marvel Comics. Was just beginning to happen. It was bursting forth. So he sent me Stan, who had been doing everything himself for years, had hired Roy and as an assistant, and needed another assistant. So they sent me the Marvel Writers Test, which was 4 pages of Jack Kirby pencils. And, if I wanted to accept this mission, I would add words to those pictures. So who wouldn't do that? It took about 10 minutes. I thought it was fun. I sent it back, and they offered me a job. Well, okay, you're this 25-year-old guy, Navy veteran, college graduate, but in a town, in a job that didn't seem to have much future. And I had managed to make some enemies in town with an ill-advised prank I pulled on the police department. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, somebody's saying, come to New York City and write comic books. So late at night, I packed up my car and I started driving east and hooked up with Roy in Manhattan, and I was off and running.
So, how much experience before you took this job at Marvel did you have writing comics?
Absolutely none. I had no idea what the technique was, what I had to learn, what I didn't have, what I didn't know. It never occurred to me to be a comic book writer. I guess I wasn't really aware that there was such a thing. If I thought about it, of course, I would have realized there had to be, but I didn't. I didn't have any reason to. I minored in creative writing in college, and I knew I wanted to write something. I was pretty sure after when I left college that I wouldn't write fiction anymore. I didn't see any future in that. So I did, in the Navy, I did journalism. After about a year of substitute teaching in St. Louis, when I got out of the service, I got a newspaper job in southeast Missouri. And I guess I thought I would be a Missouri journalist for the rest of my life, or the rest of my foreseeable life. I didn't know how to write comics. I didn't know anything at all about the business. So I was assigned to finish a script that Roy had started, featuring Patsy and Hetty, Girls on the Go-Go. I guess you would now call it a romance comic. And then I did Millie the Model, modeling with Millie, and that I had no idea at the time, but that was the best possible initiation I could have had, because it was a way to learn the basics. And yet, those were not books that anybody was paying a whole lot of attention to. So it was a place to learn the basics, comic book writing 101, and not too much was at stake. If I screwed up, well, that wouldn't be a catastrophe. And also, there was no place to learn comic book writing. There were no books on how to do comic book writing. There were no courses. You just had to pick it up. Well, my job was to imitate Stan Lee. Now, everybody imitates somebody at the beginning. Nobody, is a genius out of the box. And my job was to imitate the guy who was arguably the best comic book writer in the world at that time, and get paid for it. Again, that was an enormous bit of luck. And after 6 months, I went freelance, and some of the stuff I was doing for Marvel, I changed or worked on, adapted it, and kind of, developed my way of writing comics. I think one size does not fit all. I don't know of any comic book writers that I consider, top of the line, that do it exactly the same way. You start out doing it the way somebody else does it, because you have to start somewhere and somehow. And then if you keep at it, you will develop your own, the way of doing it that's comfortable for you. So that's the way it worked out. Eventually, I wrote a book on how to write comic books. And I've been teaching for, quarter of a century, more or less. There are stuff you can learn. I mean, the ultimate answer to how do I learn to write comics or write anything else, is sit down and do it. You teach yourself, but you can have, a teacher can point you in directions that might be good for you. And that's a long answer to a short question.
So while you were working at Marvel, how much creative control did you have on the comics that you worked on?
Absolutely none. Apart from the fact that I got to make up the stories, and I got to write the dialogue, and that's plenty. I didn't have any control about the direction the books were going. If I went back into DC today, I wouldn't have much, if any. That's not if you're working on television. if you're just a writer as opposed to a producer or showrunner, you don't have any direction about the characters' lives. You kind of do what you're told. Um, that's an old story. Almost nobody in history who did creative work had total freedom. Maybe 19th century novelists, but everybody works for somebody, and employment is always a part of the equation. And you have to remember that it's like being a kid playing ball. They own the bat, they own the gloves, their daddy owns the ballpark, and you are allowed to play. I found that to be a perfectly satisfactory situation, and I guess I still would if when I worked for television. It's been that way. Most of the novels I've written have been adapted from somebody else's work, and while I had a certain amount of freedom, I was basically retelling somebody else's story. That's the nature of the beast. The longer you stay at it, and if you become reliable and useful to the editors, then you get more freedom. So as the Batman editor, I had almost, for all practical purposes, I did have control of those characters. The company trusted me not to cross any taboos, and I had no interest in doing. I didn't want to do sex and gore. I think that is very seldom good storytelling. So as long as the books were turning a profit and I didn't cause any outrage, they let me do what I wanted. And that worked out very well for both the company and me. I did cause some outrage. We had done a year-long story subplot where Gordon, because he's a smoker, gets ill, seriously ill. And we ran that arc, and then I wrote an ad to go with it, anti-smoking ad. And in one panel of one comic book, Batman is standing on a roof, and like maybe 3 buildings down, there's part of a billboard that has a cigarette ad. Okay, my bad. I should have caught that, and I should have questioned it, but I didn't. And the guy in New York City who was working as the consumer advocate, a fellow who seemed to love cameras, he raised some hell about that. And the irony was, but we had just spent a year doing anti-smoking stuff. So I put on my jacket and I was going to walk over to NBC where this guy, I think, had first appeared. That was like a block away. And I was going to, let them tape a reply. And cooler heads prevailed. Before I could get out the door, somebody said, well, if you go and tape this reply, then he will tape a reply to your reply, and this will drag on for days. If you just let it pass, everybody will have forgotten about it within 24 hours, and that's pretty much what happened. But that was a case where there was some outrage when we did the death of Robin. That upset some people. There was another time when I mentioned a religion. I had a bad guy. Actually, it was, I think, Jim Starlin who wrote the dialogue, but I certainly let it pass. And the idea was this opinion is being delivered by a really evil guy. But nonetheless, some people got upset about that. At Marvel once I did a scene where somebody was using cocaine, and that caused some fuss. In some of those instances, I screwed up. I should have been more sensitive to the situation, more alert to possible problems. In other of those situations, well, I was telling a story. I wasn't advocating. It wasn't even me. My freelancers whom I trusted were telling a story, and we upset some people. I'm sorry about that. It's not what I wanted to do. On the other hand, we were telling a
So, as a writer, what advice do you have when you make a mistake in a comic book?
Well, I used to cry a lot, and I used to hit my head against the wall, though it bothered me at first, and it still bothers me to the extent that I don't generally read published stuff. Once it leaves my computer, I'm done with it. And mistakes creep in. Generally, they're not important. If we did things like those year-long continuities, we did those great big stories that involved all the characters that were in our stable, little mistakes are going to creep in. In one scene, Batman is fighting three thugs in the other, and then a few pages later, it's two thugs, that kind of thing. You don't like it. On the other hand, that's an enormously complicated job done under terrific deadline pressure. And I've gotten to be a little bit mellow about it, saying, yeah, I am a long way from perfect, and I've always known that. So if I give it my best shot, and I always try to do that, do the best job I'm capable of doing at that time, whatever it is. And I screw up once in a while. I don't like that, but I don't think I'm going to flog myself for it either.
So, you came over to DC after you were done working with Marvel. Who was responsible for bringing you into DC Comics?
Well, it's funny you're asking that because I did a movie shoot yesterday. Somebody's making a documentary about Charlton Comics, and that's the short answer to your question. After leaving Marvel staff, I was a freelancer. I was doing a little journalism. Somewhere in there, I wrote a book on presidential elections. There's a book that was designed to be given as Christmas presents by corporations. They would buy them in wholesale lots. And Steve Skates told me about this guy, Dick Giordano, who would come into New York City on, I think it was Thursday morning, and planned himself in a little office just off Fifth Avenue somewhere. And he was he was an editor of a comic book company, and Steve said, maybe that's going to be of some interest to you. So I said, yeah, and I went up to see Dick, and I left the office with an assignment. And then for the next year, that was part of my workload, pretty reliable part. I'd see Dick, I'd talk with him for a few minutes, I'd have a job, I'd leave, I'd bring back the job the next week and get another assignment. And on one of those mornings, he said, how would you like to do exactly what you're doing now, but at 3 times the money? Well, that was a pretty compelling argument. He was a really eloquent guy. So, of course, I said yes. What had happened was that Dick had accepted a job with DC, and he was going to bring 5 of his Charlton people with him. They were, I can probably remember, Steve Ditko, Frank McLaughlin, Steve Skates, the great Jim Apparel, and me. So Dick was hired as an editor. We tailed along after him. It had never occurred to me to go look for work at DC because I thought it was a closed shop. And I think to some degree that was true. They weren't, looking for freelancers or writers or artists. But we went in on Dick's coattails, except for 7 years of being a Marvel editor. I have been associated with the company in one way or another ever since. I got mail from them this morning. They still send me comic books. They're very nice.
So while you were working in DC, you worked on Green Arrow, and you wrote one of his best stories, and he was changed. What was the impetus for changing Green Arrow from a rich, wealthy individual to a urban superhero?
Oh, there was a couple of things. I took his money away from him in a Justice League story. Green Arrow had always been a second or third string character. He was created in 1940. There were plenty of precedents for that kind of character. There was a movie serial that was shot near where I live called Green Archer. Mostly, though, it was they'd had a tremendous success with Batman. If you look at the early Green Arrow stories, he's Batman in a different suit. He had an arrow car and an arrow cave, I think. And he was Batman, but he shot arrows. He had never been popular enough to justify his own title. He didn't seem to have much of a personality. The gimmick arrows, I think, provided a lot of the entertainment of those stories. So he was and the second part was the rich guy who's a vigilante was kind of old news. It was a kind of character that would have been more popular, was more popular in the 30s and 40s than in the 60s and 70s. I was not awfully comfortable with having basically a fat cat as a good guy. So I took his money away from him in the Justice League story for that reason, just to change the rules a little bit and to give him the kind of story that I wanted to write. Since the nice thing about working with characters that nobody much cares about is you do have freedom. I mean, I couldn't have done that with Batman. So then when my routine with Julie Schwartz was the same as my routine with Dick Giordano had been, I walk in on one morning a week, and Julie and I kind of circled around each other cautiously, because by then I was not wearing jackets and ties to the office. I was looking like that dirty hippie that I was, and I was involved with the peace movement a little bit and racial stuff a little bit. It was not a big part of my life, but it's where my sympathies clearly lay. And I don't think I have a necktie right now. I needed one for something a few years ago, and Mary said, well, we threw them all out years ago. Or a turtleneck. And Julie was a guy who wore a white shirt and a tie and commuted to Queens. His habits were very regular. If you met him on the subway, you probably wouldn't think of him as a guy in any kind of creative business. But he was, along with Stan Lee, one of the two great editors. So he decided to let me try a Green Lantern story, just science fiction. It is a time travel story, which he liked. And he worked differently with me than with his earlier writers, I think. But we got very comfortable working relationship pretty quickly. And I was in touch with Julie almost until he died. And on one of those visits to D.C., he said that they were, one of their superhero books was in danger of being canceled. and he'd like to save it, and did I have any ideas? So that book was Green Lantern. The idea I had was to start plotting stories from contemporary events. And if I was going to have this dialogue, this good versus bad, establishment versus counterculture kind of stuff, I needed two characters. I needed 2 points of view that I could express in these characters' dialogue. And, okay, we knew we were going to use Green Lantern, and who else was available? Well, the answer was Green Arrow, and who, by happy coincidence, Neil had just, for Justice League, had redesigned his costume. It had been a kind of a nothing costume, not very interesting. He did not look very interesting. Well, when Neil was done with him, he was a modern-day Robin Hood, an alpha male with a beard, very contemporary-looking guy. Since he didn't have much of a personality, I could make him a rebel, a counterculture guy who worked with and against a guy who represented the very best elements, the establishment, and that was Green Lantern. Green Lantern was like the best cop who ever lived, and the only big flaw that he had was he just obeyed. You know, these blue guys told him to do something, and he did it without question. That was something, a personality trait that I didn't think was healthy, and by God, I still don't. Always question authority. Well, we grew up in a world where we weren't supposed to do that. Mary Fran, my wife, who was my high school girlfriend, and I talk about that once in a while. We were taught not to question, just, listen to what the authority figure says and do it. Well, the Vietnam War had taught everybody who was paying attention that that's not a good idea. I liked and approved in certain ways of Hal Jordan in that he was trying to do what was right and working to the best of his knowledge for a better universe. So we had him, and then we, with maybe a little nip and tuck here and there, we had Green Arrow, and he came with some baggage. He had a sidekick, Speedy, and we gave him a girlfriend, Black Canary, to give him a kind of rounded work. And then I gave him some of those, what actors call funny hat character bits, like he loved chili. I don't know particularly where that came from, but it added a little flavor, no pun intended, to the character. And working with Julie was a treat because his only interest was good stories. His ego never got into the process. And I can remember, he would ask for a word change or something like that. No serious editing at all. And yet, if I needed him, he was there. If I walked in with the story that he was going to ask me to write pretty much worked out in my head, I would tell him that, and that was a very short visit. He'd say, in effect, okay, go write it. If I went in with my cupboard bare and I needed help, Julie and I would talk until I had enough to at least begin the story. So I think as much as anything, he saw editing not as being the boss, but as being the teacher and helper. I took as much of that as I was capable of when I became the Batman editor. It is not ever about me. It is my job is to make the freelancers, the writers and artists look good, and I should be the invisible part of the process. Anyway, that's how we came up with that particular team up. It is some of the Batman stuff has found its way on the television as Arrow stories, which is kind of strange, but okay.
So your work on Green Arrow, how did that affect your life as you were gaining success in the comic world?
Well, at the time there was no publicity department in any comic book, uh, but the media picked up on what we were doing, which was radical and different. We did not do the first socially relevant comic book story ever. Some of the very early Superman stories had to do with real life problems. There's a brilliant story published in about 1948 with art by Joe Orlando in one of the EC books about racism. But we kind of made it the centerpiece of the series. And talking to Neil recently, I found out that some of what I considered problems he didn't. But I got to write about stuff that was genuinely concerning me. And we started getting invitations to get interviewed, and I was on Parisian television. Wow. And going to universities and going on the radio, that was pretty heady stuff because, comic book guys were little guys who were riding the subway and anonymous pretty much. I guess we were the first comic book stars since I think Siegel and Schuster got a lot of publicity for Superman back in the 40s. So, okay, hooray for that. But did it influence my income? Not a bit. No, I got the same, I think it was $15 a page for those stories as I got for anything else that I did. We got some pats on the back, especially when the mayor of New York offered to write a text piece. The Honorable John V. Lindsay, the last liberal Republican to have his job. And, okay, well, as far as the company was concerned, the mayor is writing in a comic book. That's pretty good. So everybody was kind of happy. We got a few hate letters, but very few. Generally, the response was overwhelmingly positive. And I don't know what was in Neil's head, and mine was, well, yeah, we're pushing the envelope. And the conventional wisdom was that any given comic book would be forgotten in about a month. So I thought, or 3 months at the outside. I thought maybe these will last a year in people's memories. Yeah, I guess that's nice. And I would not have believed that many years later those stories would be reprinted in hardcover at $75 a pop. I didn't have any idea that the medium would become important, especially not important enough to receive that kind of publication. But it was a start, and from there on, then things got quiet again, and people would occasionally mention those stories, and they got reprinted. Before they did the hardcover, I thought, well, this isn't going to sell because anybody who could conceivably have wanted to read these stories has read them. They've been reprinted so often, but they sold out. So good thing I'm not on the business end of comic books.
When you inherited the title of Batman to write, you had to deal with the show and the comedy elements. How did you go about making Batman darker again?
Well, it was similar to the Green Arrow situation. I walked into Julie's office. What had happened was that Batman was one of the 3 superheroes in DC's line that had survived that 10-year dark ages when comic books, most of the companies went out of business. and the ones that survived just barely survived. But that had changed partially because the camp became a fad. And they did a TV show on ABC, a Batman TV show that was comedic. Camp is a fairly complicated subject, and there's stuff on it that you can read about it online. But for our purposes, it was a one-line joke. The joke is, I love this stuff when I was 8 years old, and now that I'm 28 and I've got a job on Wall Street, and I've got 2 divorces in my past, and I'm very small. I drink a little too much, and I see my psychiatrist twice a week. But now that I'm that sophisticated person, look how silly it is. I can laugh at what I used to like, what I used to be. Thing really caught on. I was living in Greenwich Village, and I would, there were a lot of professors and writers and arts people, and you would see them watching Batman. It was on twice a week. The Tuesday episode ended with a cliffhanger. That was resolved, and the story was rounded off on the Thursday episode. The comedy was achieved in addition to that kind of comedic plot structure with what I hope was deliberately bad overacting and silly costume or costumes that might not have fitted as well as they should, and taking Gotham City, which is a fantasy world. It is a world in which Batman can exist, and it is dark, and it is grim, and it is everything that's bad about New York City, and transposing it to Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles on a bright and beautiful July day, and this guy with a costume that doesn't fit as well as it might is walking down this Los Angeles street. So of course, you change the context, and it's going to look silly. So that show was hugely popular for one season. Kind of popular for a second. It limped into a third, and then it was over. It was like somebody turned out a light. Nation had tired of camp and had moved on. So I walked in. The comic books had kind of been trying to follow the lead of the TV show, because the TV show had raised the circulation of the comics. I don't think very many comic book guys liked it. I know Stan Lee didn't, because the morning after the first episode, I asked him about it, and he said, well, yeah, he likely had a bit of animation that opened the show, pre-credits, and not much of the rest of it. I don't think that many of my colleagues, their sensibilities did not respond to that kind of humor, and either did mine. The first time Julie Schwartz offered me Batman, it was in the middle of that show's success, and I thought, well, this just isn't my kind of thing. It's probably nothing I'd do well. I did write a straight Batman story fill-in for him about New Orleans jazz, which he loved and I like. And that eventually got printed. But basically, yeah, they did some of the things that the TV show did. But I don't think that many comic book guys were comfortable with camp. But all of a sudden, no camp. So Julie said, in effect, we're obviously going to continue to publish Batman, but no camp. So in that inimitable Jewish uncle way that Julie has, well, my boy, what do you got? Well, now the terms of the assignment was, it's a blank slate, do something with it, just like Green Arrow or Green Lantern had been. What I thought I did was go back to what Bill Finger and Bob Kane started with in May of 1939 and add to it what the world had learned about how to tell comic book stories, what's a technique. And that's what we created. According to one historian, it's what changed Batman. I have since had reason to go back and actually look at that early stuff. And everything that Neil and Julie and I did is strongly implicit in the stories that Bill Finger wrote in the late 1930s, but not, and especially after the fifth Batman story, Origin, where he sees his parents killed, a nightmare for any kid. Very powerful images, but it was not emphasized. And after Robin was introduced about 11 months later, tone of the character changed from this lone nocturnal avenger to a kind of, if not father figure, the best big brother anybody ever had. And for great stretches of the time, the origins were not mentioned. And then in the 50s, Batman, 50s were a period that valued conformity, kind of Chamber of Commerce values. And Batman, well, in a story that I read that was published in 1945, he was already a cop. He had a platinum police badge, it said. We never saw it, at least not in that story, but with Batman Lie, I'm sure he had a platinum police badge. And the vigilante element of the character that was in the first stories was like Commissioner Gordon vowing to get that guy. That was all gone. He was a cop. He was an establishment figure. And then in the 50s, that was pushed to an extreme. In one of the stories, there was a contest. Spend a day with Batman and Robin in the flying Batcave. He was obviously the Donald Trump of Gotham City, a very much visible guy who participated in civic events and walked down the street in the middle of the day. It was what it was. I don't find those stories, I think I didn't find them very enjoyable when I read a sampling of them. But they were probably right for when they were published. That was probably a good, if not the best way to do Batman in that time. Then in the 60s, it started out as with the comedic version when the country had a kind of anti-establishment mood. And then Neil and I did our Secret of the Waiting Graves, and that kind of set the tone for the character. And the character has gone several shades darker than anything I would have considered doing. But it is still that basic character. So what happened was, Neil and I don't know if I should blame Neil for this, but what we were doing was having a false memory. This is what we thought Batman was like back in the 40s, or actually the late 30s, and was not real. Everything that we did was in Bill Finger's work. You could find it there, and it popped up here and there over the years. But the dominant Batman was probably the one that was not a vigilante and that was a solid citizen. The country was recovering from a war. You didn't want somebody attacking the establishment when the establishment was just trying to recover from one of the few truly just wars in history, which caused great disruption of family and a horror. So we wanted our heroes to be kind of psychologically safe. And then in the 60s, the attitude toward war changed for a lot of people, including me. When I started off, I enlisted in the Navy, partially because I believed what I was told, that if I didn't help stop them commies over in Asia, they'd be camping on my mother's lawn by Christmas, based on no real fact. And like millions of my contemporaries, we realized that was basically a lie. And if you doubt one part of the establishment, you tend to question the other parts. So in the 60s, they were ready for a comedic version of Batman. And by the time Neil and I came along, well, they were ready for something else. your generation, my son's generation, you've grown up in a much grimmer world than I did. Whenever I see Batman on a lunchbox or the Batman roller coaster at the amusement park and a strong play to children, I think, don't they realize you're talking about a guy who saw his parents murdered and is obsessed with crime? He's one of the grimmest major characters ever, but that's okay. They do well with the merchandise, and it doesn't prevent guys like me from writing the stories that we think are appropriate to write. I don't want to carry it as far as some people did. I don't want to make him a jerk. He is still a hero, and in my private interpretation of Batman, he is not crazy because he is capable of stopping. When someone who is schizophrenic would have to do what he does. In his case, it is a choice he's made to allow this childhood trauma to partially shape his life. Also, I think he probably kind of gets off on being Batman. But I would not make him as dark as other writers have, because then, in my estimation, he wouldn't be a hero anymore.
When did you begin to edit Batman?
I think it started in '85. I had worked for Marvel for about 7 years. Dick Giordano, who had taken a job as the editor-in-chief at DC, offered me a job being the Batman editor. I stewed about it for a while because I had given 7 years to Marvel. But at the end of various things happened that nudged me toward DC. It's a little bit more complicated than I'm making it sound, but a few weeks later, I got a phone call from Dick on my answering machine. He said, in effect, "You start Monday, welcome aboard." I'd had some bad times in my 30s. There were people who at DC didn't trust me, and they were right not to. Paul Levitz once told me that we didn't expect you to live to be 40. Well, I'm 76 now, so take that, you guys. Dick decided that he would take a chance on me, I guess. And I felt that I had better be really towing the mark and not give anybody any reason to question. And that's kind of what happened. But after a year or so, I realized I don't really have to wear a jacket and tie to work. That's overdoing the goody two-shoes image. Sometimes you win the lottery, and when I went to work for DC, I won it. It was a great job. I worked with great people. I'm still in touch with many of them and friendly with all of them. The job became one which involved a lot of travel for decades. Comic book guys were guys that lived in Queens, took the subway to work, had a 2-week vacation, and no expense account. Well, that had all changed. Comic books were in the process of becoming respectable and becoming accepted as a legitimate narrative form. So all of a sudden the job became very interesting as well as respectable. Anything I proposed, nothing I ever proposed was turned down. In effect, I got to do what I wanted. And I worked with 3 guys. If I had dropped dead, any one of the 3 could have, sat behind my desk, and no reader would know the difference. And as I said, I'm still in it. 2 of them were here yesterday on a visit. It just became the greatest. I had as a toy to play with Batman, who was a tremendously flexible storytelling tool. And it was recognized by maybe 70 to 80% of the people on the planet. I'm looking at a marionette that we bought off of a guy who was sitting on a blanket in a square in a little Mexico town. And he was selling, as well as some Aztec gods, he was selling Batman marionette and a Bart Simpson doll or marionette. So it's a character that everybody kind of recognizes, even if you have never read a comic book. You know who Batman is. You know who Superman is. And I was given a great deal of freedom in how to use this character, and occasionally we got to do something that I think was useful to the society as a whole. I don't know where you stand politically, but we did after a friend of ours was killed in a senseless shooting, not a friend, the son of a colleague died on Jane Street in Greenwich Village in a shooting that has never been solved and probably never will be, a senseless crime. But we did an anti-gun issue, and later Jeanette Kahn introduced us to a lot of people who were concerned with landmines. I don't know that I was aware of landmines when I went into that building. I certainly didn't have any care about them, but Jeanette said, meeting in the conference room at 3, and I walked in there, and there was one of my favorite folk singers. Wow, Judy Collins, and I'm in the same room with her. And some guys in suits and ties that obviously were not comic book people, and it was about landmines, which are a terrible, terrible problem in a lot of parts of the world. So we did a Batman story in which he fails. A little girl dies from a landmine before Batman can rescue her. And the Superman guys did a how-to book, which was intended for kids. Kids are the main victim of landmines. And, basically the Superman book had to do with this is what they look like, this is where you're likely to find them, this is what you do if you see one. Is basically run like hell. So we got to do things like that made me feel good as a citizen and a father and all those things that I am in addition to being a comic book guy. So how could you, and everywhere I had gotten married to my childhood sweetheart somewhere near the beginning of that process, I think in '88, and she got to go with me everywhere that I went, which means that not only did I have company, that was sometimes the worst part of going to conventions. You arrive back in LaGuardia Airport at 1 a.m. and go home to an empty apartment. Well, I had company, and I had somebody who could keep track of the airplane tickets and the schedules and so on. So it just became a dream job. Given my limitations and my pluses, it was probably the best job there was. I can't imagine a better one.
So, as an editor, what was your role with Jason Todd's death?
Well, Jeanette Kahn used to have editorial retreats where she would get all the editors and most of the assistants together someplace not in New York City, and we would work out in broad general strokes what the company would be doing for the next 6 months or so. I later started doing that just with the Batman guys, and it was one of the best tools that I had. Anyway, at the end of one of those retreats, Jeanette and somebody whose name is escaping me and I were sitting in a room, Mohawk Mountain House, 25 miles from where I'm standing, and waiting for a ride back to New York City and kind of talking idly. And we had a problem, which I was not doing a very good job of solving. It was a Robin problem. Somehow the character had evolved in a way that made him not a very pleasant guy. Jerry Conway created him, and that's not what Jerry had in mind, but he had become kind of a brat. That's not an attractive trait, so I could either write him out of the series and replace him. I don't think the corporation would let me just get rid of him. Or we could give him some reason to have a change of personality. And then I thought, well, is this someone we can let the readers decide? And I think it was me that came up with that idea. It could have been Jeanette. In any case, Jeanette immediately liked it, and set in motion the stuff that we had to have to make it work. So I handled the editorial end. I worked on a story with Jim Aparo, and actually only a couple of panels on the last page would have needed to be changed. Jeanette worked out the business with the phone company, and we went. We could not work it so that people who got their Batman comics from the newsstand could participate in it. But for the direct sales market, they had 3 days. You dial one number, or they wouldn't let me use the word death or dying in the advertising for this. So in one case, I forget what we said, but the Joker's plan succeeds, and you dial another number, and it doesn't. Dick was sure it would be thumbs up because he didn't think the readers would want Robin to die. Even that Robin, that was not Dick Grayson. And I thought that they would want him killed just to see if we had nerve enough to do it. So after 3 days, Mary Fran and I were alone in my office, and I picked up the phone, and I called a special number that would give me the final tally, and oops, thumbs down. Well, okay, it was not by a very big margin, and I've heard that one guy programmed his computer to dial the killing number, repeatedly. So if that's true, that one guy made the difference. It was like 56 votes difference out of over 10,000 cast. And so I took the correct page and I walked it down to the production office, and we got in the elevator and went home and kind of had a weekend. And when I got back on Monday morning, oh boy, for about 3 days, much of what I did was just talk on the phone to radio people. It got way more publicity than it deserved. The local newspapers picked up on it. As I said, I was a nonstop spokesman. The woman who was in charge of PR did not let me go on television. I mean, at one point, I think there was a news crew that showed up, and all I or anybody else would have had to do was walk out the door, and we could have hyped the thing. She didn't want us to do that, and I don't know why. I could kind of see not wanting me to be on television, but Jeanette or Dick, articulate, bright people, authorities, for whatever reason, we were kept anonymous, and I'm glad, because the reaction was huge, and I was still riding in the subway downtown every night. I am glad that this face was not associated with that stunt, because you never know what kind of disturbed person is out there. Anyway, so it was a kind of collaboration between the writer, Jim Starlin, and Jeanette, and me. I was thinking of it as participatory storytelling, the kind of stuff that was happening occasionally in theater, where the audience would actually participate in the event. One of the attacks we got from the comic book establishment was we had staged a Roman circus. We had killed this innocent boy, and I finally look, do you people realize no kid was killed? We're talking about paper and ink and Jim Starlin's imagination. We didn't kill anybody, and we didn't endorse killing. We told an unusual story. And I thought I would have a year to figure out a replacement for Robin, and then the next day the corporation said, no, we have to have a Robin. So we scrambled around. I thought that Starlin and Marv Wolfman did a great job of coming up with the next Robin. What they did answered some of the objections that were to the old Robin, the main one of which is, some father figure, Bruce Wayne, is he takes an 8-year-old and puts him in terrible danger 5 nights a week. Jim and Marv made him older and more mature, and I called a guy named Elliot Brown and had him design a costume. I don't think that's been used very much, but it was a costume that had all kinds of safety features built in. Even, I think, gyroscope. So they came up with a character that would have been, even without the Batman connection, would have probably been a popular character. And at the end of the day, I'm glad we did. It was an interesting thing to try, and anything you can do that's not illegal or immoral, you ought to do.
When did you step down from editing Batman?
About 14 or 15 years ago, we had a lot of success, and about a year before that, one of my assistants, Jordan Gorfinkel, came in on a Monday morning with an outline he'd done on his own, wasn't an assignment, over the weekend, for a story in which Gotham City is devastated by an earthquake. There were, on the face of it, a whole lot of problems with such a story, but by then, my three assistants and I knew we were all quitting within a year. And Paul knew that. I mean, I had discussions with him about it, and at one point I was going to quit 3 years earlier, and he persuaded me, go 3 more years, round it off. So we knew that this was our last hurrah. Now, we could have just gone on automatic pilot. Of course, we could do Batman comics. We had been doing it successfully for years. We knew how to do that job. But we decided that we would either go out with a huge success or we would fall on our faces embarrassingly. So I took Jordan's outline and I took it to the executives, and kind of reluctantly they approved of it. So off we were. I called an editorial meeting. I got as many people as I reasonably could. We talked about the thing for 3 days. We began to get resistance within the company, to the point at one point I was thinking, well, if you guys had so many reservations about this, why are you letting me do it? I would be perfectly happy to just deliver another year's worth of Batman stories. Would certainly make my life easier. But we went ahead with it, and our vindication came 3 months into it. Paul was in Baltimore with 100 of the comic book shop managers and owners, and he asked if I would drive down on Sunday afternoon. So I did, and he publicly apologized to me for doubting the story, because by that time it was clear that we had a monster success on our hands. It was a chance to introduce new characters. It was a chance to tell the kind of story that nobody had ever really told before. It was a chance to reintroduce all of our favorite villains. It was tricky and difficult, and I have a rule about not opening on a dull shot. It was one of our Batman mantras that you open on action. Well, in this case, twice in the course of that 2,000-something page continuity, we had to show them a map in order for the readers to understand, okay, here's where the bad guys are, here's where the good guys are, here's where the problems are. So I broke my own rule twice because I couldn't think of any other way to do it. But none of that seemed to make any difference. It was a big success. Again, I'm very glad we tried it. If I had some bit of wisdom to pass to my successors, I would say that we did a number of those things, which I was calling mega series at the time. Long continuities that involved more than one title for more than 6 months. But you have to start with a story that will bear that weight. You don't start saying, I'm going to do an 1,100-page continuity and not know what it's about. We did those things when somebody like Jordan came in with an idea that we thought would sustain a really long, complicated story. So as a storyteller, it was a chance to do what nobody had ever quite done before. There'd been a lot of crossovers and that kind of thing, starting in about 1940. but nobody had done this kind of story. For example, we needed a new Batgirl. This was a chance to introduce characters in such a way that they would be likely noticed. And so it was. We finished that, and my three assistants and I went our ways. DC decided what kind of replacement they wanted for me, and they hired Bob Schreck. And Paul told me at the time that I was probably the last editor who would ever have a major franchise for more than about 3 years. In other words, they expected the Batman and the Superman and so forth, Wonder Woman, editors to change a lot more often than they had. I don't know if that's true or not. I know Bob is head of another comic book company. I'm not sure who's editing Batman right now.
Before we go into your work outside of comics, what was your role in Transformers?
Almost none. Other editors were getting these outside jobs, so I wrote what I thought was a funny memo to Jim Shooter, indicating I was willing to, do some of that outside work. And his policy was to give creative stuff to editors whenever possible. So I took a shot at doing Transformers, and I guess Jim didn't like it. I got a kill fee, which was a generous one for the amount of work. Probably took me about a week of writing time. And somewhere in there, I seem to have created Optimus Prime. That's what they tell me. I have no reason to doubt these people, so I will say yes. My take on it was way different. And given the success of the movies, they were probably right.
So outside of comics, you worked and you created a book, the DC Guide, How to Write Comics.
Yeah.
How did that idea come up?
Somebody told me that they were going to do it. And I told Paul Levitz I would kill my mother's dog to write such a book. And he said, well, we can't let your mother's dog die, so yeah, you've got the job. I had been teaching comics writing for, like maybe 10 years by that time, so I had notes. I thought I would just take and rewrite my notes, and this would end up being a pretty easy job. It ended up being kind of quite a lot of work, but they're still selling it on eBay. I don't think it's the best How to Write Comics book. I think it was the best when it came out, but Peter David's is arguably better, and Carl Potts' book I think is unquestionably better than mine. I would put mine in the top 5, but there are some that are better now. And I invited Carl Potts to lecture to my comics writing class, and I think that the 2 hours that he was talking to them were the most, in terms of learning useful stuff, the best 2 hours of that semester. But that's how it came about. The job was there, and in some ways, since I had both extensive experience as a writer and by that time a decent amount of experience as a teacher, in some ways I was the logical choice.
So as a teacher, what do you teach your students when teaching a writing class on comics?
Well, I have about 22 hours worth of information that I can convey, and I like to leave a little elbow room so that if I have a chance to have somebody like Carl Potts come in, I can do it. But you can't teach anybody to write. You can't teach anybody to be creative. What you can do is show them shortcuts, make them aware of certain things that they may not know about that they would find useful. Give them some coaching, some help, some encouragement. So I kind of pride myself on the fact that most of my teaching is kind of left brain information. This is how many panels on a page. This is how you decide how many panels on a page. That kind of thing. It's technique. It's what people don't think about when they're not professional writers. I have them each I tell them what mistakes I'll bet as beginners that at least some of them are going to make, and give them a final script to do. If I need to be grading that semester, that's probably mostly what will determine their grade. It's a tricky thing because when grades are concerned, because they're not all starting from the same place. I will have a bright 17-year-old who just really likes comics, and a 45-year-old who's been a professional writer for 20 years who wants to find out about this as a possible way for him to earn more of his living. So it's not fair to judge them on quality. I can judge them on professionalism. If I say that the script is due on the 15th, the 16th is not okay. You can't turn it in late and not have your grade suffer. Because as an editor, it's true of me and every other comic book editor I know, the biggest problem we have is deadlines. Because for some reason people don't think, people who will be super reliable when they're writing for television won't be when they're doing it for comics. Somehow it doesn't seem important to them. It's a very difficult form of editing. I've edited a news magazine, for example. You'd think that since that's dealing with real life stuff, it would be harder, but it's much easier. Because with comics, every job involves you getting work on time from a writer, a penciler, an inker, a letterist, all those people who live in widely scattered parts of the country, not always on the same continent. It all has to come together in a month. So it can be a very difficult job. So I can in the classroom I can emphasize that, for example. Emphasize the need for professionalism, and then give the techniques. If you're going to play the violin, you've got to learn the scales. The stuff I learned when I was doing Millie the Model, I can teach. I can't make somebody creative. I can't make them a good writer. I think that at one time I thought all it really takes is diligence. If you want to work hard enough, you can become a writer or a penciler, an inker. With all the experience I've had, I don't believe that anymore. I wish I could believe it. But you have to start with something. I think some kind of genetic predisposition to doing this work. But if you have that, there are maybe ways I can help you. There's shortcuts. There can things that I had to learn by trial and error. I can just tell you, and you'll at least know about them. So it depends on what college I'm teaching at, but generally it takes between 25 and 30 hours to just give them hard information and encouragement, and I tell a lot of stories along the way and have a guest or two.
So before we go, do you have any advice that you can give to people who want to write comics and be in the writing industry?
Well, I can tell you some things that seem to be true. One of them is you have to start with wanting to be a writer or a storyteller. It's maybe not a good idea to start with wanting to be part of the comic book scene, which is a pretty cool scene. I'm not knocking it. You get, except for San Diego, you get to go to conventions free, and sometimes you get free comics and stuff, and maybe your peer group recognizes your name. But the ones that I think became really good and maintained quality over a long stretch of time were people who wanted to tell stories and found comic books a congenial way to do it. They had a liking or a feel for the medium. I think Bill Finger had that in 1939, a sense of what a comic book is and how to use its strengths and its limitations. If you have that, that's a good start. If you just want to be super fan, it might not be good. One of the problems with fans who become professionals, I think, is that as a fan, you do this when you feel like it. I'll work on my comic book this afternoon because it's raining and the day in the park has been canceled. If you're a professional, you do it. you get the job done. I started thinking about technique, about structure when I realized working for Charlton, I'm not going to be inspired 5 or 6 times a month. I'm going to need a way to write this stuff where it will be acceptable. And it won't always be great. It'll probably never be great, but it won't sink below a certain level. And so what is there that I can think about as opposed to trusting instinct or talent to get this work done? And I guess Dick Giordano and I once talked about our insecurities. Like, we were both very well-established professionals by then, but there's a part of me that thinks if I screw this up, they'll never give me another job. And to my surprise, that was Dick's attitude, too. So that's one piece of advice I get. Become a writer. Don writes screenplays, and I sometimes wonder why he doesn't want to write novels. The other thing is read and get as much information in your head as you can. You don't know where your story ideas are going to come from, but they're not likely to come from old comic books. What are you going to bring to the table that we haven't seen before? Now, you can't do radical stuff, experimental stories. Of course, it has to be a good story, well told, but maybe the particular setting or content or plot twist, something that you read will suggest that, which is why I tend to want to read more fact than fiction. That's changed a lot, but I don't think I read 3 novels a month now. And when I was working in comics all the time, I probably read 2 or 3 a week. But one of the most successful short stories I ever published came because I was reading a book about medical anomalies, and I came across this thing having to do with epilepsy. And with that as a starting place, I published a story that got picked up as one of the best of the year, yada, yada, yada. I have used almost everything in my life in a comic book at one time or another, including the time I spent aboard an aircraft carrier that made it into, for a couple of panels, into a Batman story. So live in a way that's comfortable to you. I don't advise anybody repeating my life because there were some pretty perilous times in there. But read, learn things, and resign yourself to this fact that if you're going to be serious about doing this, you're going to sit down for, well, you'll decide, 20 hours a week, 40 hours a week, in a room by yourself in front of a screen or a piece of paper, manipulating words. After 50 years almost of doing it, I like that. People who may have talent but can't reconcile themselves to that aspect of a writer's life, they might do well on talent for a few years, but there will come a time in which it becomes really hard for them to work. Well, I think that, among other things, we all owe ourselves a decent life. And if you hate going to work every day, that's not going to equal a decent life. For me, a lot of times my private life was going to hell, but I could go into that room and I could shut all that out and get paid for it. But you will find out, as I will tell you what works for me in terms of, say, scheduling my writing week. And that'll be a place for you to start. And as time passes, you'll probably find that other things work better for you. You ought to not get stuck someplace. So I've completely lost track of your question, but I hope I answered it.
And finally, do you have anything you would like to promote or suggest to your fans?
One of the ways that things I incorporated into my version of Batman was an essay by Alfred Bester, who was arguably the best science fiction writer of the 20th century, certainly one of the best, who started in comics. He was a friend of Julie Schwartz. And he wrote an essay for the Science Fiction Writers magazine about writing obsessed character. And I thought, yeah, that's Batman. That's the key to the psychology of this character. He is obsessed. I got to know Alfie later, And there's one quote of his that I would recommend any wannabe professional writer put on a 3x5 card, tape it above their workspace. And it's this: among professionals, the job is boss, which means it's never about you. It's about this story that you have agreed to tell. Not about you at all. It's about the story. Among professionals, the job is boss. And those are the words that I would suggest writers live by.